December 1944. The Ardennes. Snow falls in thick, heavy silence across the Belgian forest. The rumble of engines fades, then dies altogether. Inside a frozen Panzer IV, German tankers sit in the dark, their breath misting against cold steel. The radio crackles with static. Orders are clear, advance, but the fuel gauge tells another story. Empty. They wait, listening to the forest. Somewhere beyond the trees, distant thunder rolls. Not from the sky, but from engines. American engines. Convoys stretching miles long, carrying drums of fuel, roaring through mud and ice without pause. The German commander lowers his head. His men stare at the fuel gauge, then at one another. Disbelief written across their faces. They had fought bravely, skillfully, but now they were prisoners of logistics, trapped by a shortage more fatal than bullets. As their tanks freeze in place, the enemies keep moving. For the men inside those steel coffins, one truth becomes painfully clear. America had fuel for everyone, and Germany had none left to burn. The question is, how did that happen? The story of America's unstoppable fuel machine began long before the Ardennes froze over. To understand how German tank crews found themselves stranded while American columns surged endlessly forward, we must go back to the foundations of a war that would come to be decided not just by guns or courage, but by gasoline. In 1939, when Hitler's armies invaded Poland, Germany's tanks moved with terrifying speed. The world called it blitzkrieg, lightning war. But lightning burns fast. Every panzer, every truck, every aircraft relied on one fragile lifeline: oil. Germany had no native oil fields. Their entire military machine ran on synthetic fuel, squeezed from coal through an expensive and time-consuming chemical process known as the Fischer-Tropsch method. For every liter of gasoline produced, resources were drained elsewhere. Labor, coal, time. The Reich was powerful, but its energy was built on sand. Across the Atlantic, the United States faced no such constraint. America was the world's largest oil producer, pumping millions of barrels a day from Texas, California, and Oklahoma. Long before Pearl Harbor, American engineers had already mastered the logistics of mass movement. Pipelines, tank farms, refineries, and a coast-to-coast railway network. When war finally reached them in December 1941, the U.S. wasn't just ready to fight. It was ready to fuel the world. From the first moment of America's full mobilization, petroleum became the bloodstream of the Allied war effort. The War Production Board prioritized oil above nearly all else. Refineries worked around the clock, and brand-new facilities rose from empty fields in record time. By 1943, the United States was producing nearly 60% of the world's petroleum. That meant not only enough for its own forces, but enough to supply Britain, the Soviet Union, and the Free French as well. Germany's strategists saw the danger early. In 1942, Hitler's summer offensive toward the Caucasus wasn't just about territory. It was a desperate gamble for oil. The objective was simple: seize the fields of Baku, capture the lifeblood of the Soviet Union, and secure the Reich's fuel future. But it failed. The German Sixth Army was destroyed at Stalingrad, and with it, any hope of a self-sustaining fuel supply. From that point on, the balance tilted irreversibly. American engineers built floating oil pipelines under the English Channel. Operation PLUTO, the pipeline under the ocean, to pump gasoline directly from England to the front lines in France. Fuel trucks followed in endless convoys, their engines humming day and night. The Red Ball Express, a supply route operated largely by African-American drivers, moved thousands of tons of gasoline daily to the advancing Allied armies. Meanwhile, German tank crews counted every liter. Luftwaffe squadrons grounded planes to conserve fuel. Training hours were cut. Even the mighty Tiger tanks, the pride of the Wehrmacht, became logistical burdens, devouring more than 500 liters of fuel every 100 kilometers. By 1944, Germany's armored divisions were increasingly static, forced to fight not as a lightning force, but as scattered islands of resistance. The contrast could not have been more stark. In Allied camps, engines never stopped. In German lines, silence grew heavier with every passing week. And yet, behind that silence was a truth often overlooked. Wars are not only fought by soldiers, they are fought by engineers, by oilmen, by logisticians who never see the front. The real battlefield stretched from the Texas oil fields to the refineries of Baton Rouge, across the Atlantic, and into every jerrycan loaded onto a Sherman tank. By the end of 1944, America was producing so much fuel that it could afford to burn what Germany could barely find. To German tank crews, it seemed impossible, unnatural, that their enemies could drive endlessly, while they themselves could barely start their engines. But the answer was rooted not in luck nor in chance, but in an industrial miracle decades in the making. Because while Germany built tanks, America built systems. And those systems, pipelines, refineries, convoys, and men trained to run them, would decide who moved forward and who stayed behind. To grasp how decisive fuel became in this global conflict, one must see how each nation viewed energy itself. For Nazi Germany, oil was an obstacle, something to be conquered, stolen, or synthesized. For the United States, oil was an industry, something to be expanded, refined, and distributed with precision. From 1942 onward, the difference became painfully visible. American refineries weren't just producing gasoline, they were producing high-octane aviation fuel, the lifeblood of modern air power. This was the unseen weapon that allowed Allied bombers to reach deeper into Europe, and Allied fighters to climb higher and faster than their German counterparts. Each gallon of this advanced fuel meant more range, more speed, and ultimately, more dominance in the sky. While American plants refined by the millions of barrels, Germany's factories struggled beneath constant bombardment. The synthetic fuel plants at Leuna, Politz, and Bleckhammer became prime targets for the U.S. 8th Air Force. In 1944, the Allies launched Operation Point Blank, a coordinated air campaign aimed directly at crippling Germany's fuel production. By mid-year, these raids had reduced synthetic fuel output by over 90%. For German panzer divisions, the result was catastrophic. Fuel trains arrived days late, if at all. Tank crews often had to abandon their machines when supplies failed to reach them. In some cases, officers were forced to make impossible choices, save enough fuel to retreat, or risk it all in a last desperate counterattack. The mechanized heart of Blitzkrieg was bleeding dry. Meanwhile, in America, fuel production was scaling to unimaginable levels. Across the Gulf Coast, the U.S. Navy and private industry joined hands to construct an unbroken web of refineries and storage depots. The war emergency pipelines, the Big Inch and Little Big Inch, were completed in record time. Stretching from Texas to New Jersey, they carried millions of barrels of oil every week, safely beyond the reach of German U-boats. It was industrial mobilization at its peak, invisible to the battlefield, but decisive for it. On the other side of the Atlantic, American fuel engineers worked under constant fire to extend their reach. When Allied forces landed in Normandy in June 1944, portable pipelines were laid across beaches within days. By late summer, 1.6 million gallons of fuel were flowing daily into France. This was the true backbone of the Allied advance. Not just tanks, but the gasoline that fed them. To understand the psychological contrast, picture two columns on the same continent. On one side, American Shermans rolling across France, their engines roaring with confidence, refueled at every stop from mobile depots that seemed endless. Drivers laughed, smoked, sang, They expected fuel to be waiting for them. On the other side, German Panthers crawling forward cautiously, every kilometer measured in liters. Crews whispering to conserve idle time. Commanders arguing over rationing. The same soldiers who once raced through Europe now crawled through it, chained by shortages. And yet, the German army's discipline and ingenuity still impressed their enemies. Captured panzer officers often spoke bitterly, not of defeat in battle, but of being outfueled. They drive as if gasoline grows from the ground, one officer reportedly said after the Battle of the Bulge. To him, America's fuel abundance seemed supernatural, a luxury no European army had ever known. But there was nothing magical about it. The Americans had simply mastered logistics at a scale no one had imagined possible. The oil companies, Standard Oil, Shell, Texaco, became engines of war. Civilian truckers became soldiers of supply. An American industry, once known for its consumer economy, transformed into a war machine fueled by science, coordination, and sheer volume. By late 1944, every major Allied push, from Patton's race across France to Montgomery's drive through Holland, was powered by this invisible tide of fuel. Behind every advance, there was a supply column hundreds of miles long, operating with clockwork precision. And behind every German retreat, there was an empty tank, a symbol of a nation whose reach had exceeded its resources. The stage was set for the most dramatic fuel crisis of the entire war, one that would expose, more clearly than ever before, just how much power flowed not from steel or fire, but from oil. Every great war can be studied through its weapons, its battles, or its leaders. But the story of fuel is different. It is invisible, quiet, and relentless, the unseen force that decided how far a tank could roll, how long an aircraft could fly, and whether an army could live or die. To truly understand why German tank crews were astonished by America's fuel abundance, we must examine this war through several key angles: human, technological, industrial, and strategic. For every German tanker who turned a key and heard only silence, the war became personal. They had trained for battle, not for waiting. Yet by 1944, much of their time was spent conserving, siphoning, or begging for fuel. Crews would drain disabled tanks just to give one machine enough to move. Some units used horse-drawn carts to carry ammunition and rations. The very image of modern warfare, armored columns sweeping forward, was now breaking apart. In contrast, American soldiers lived inside an industrial rhythm that seemed impossible to stop. The Red Ball Express thundered down makeshift highways, hauling over 12,000 tons of supplies a day. Drivers slept in their cabs, fueled on coffee and adrenaline, knowing that the tanks up front depended entirely on their endurance. Many of these men were young and inexperienced, yet they performed a logistical miracle, keeping entire armies in motion. For the German crews, the silence of empty tanks became psychological torture. For the Americans, the constant roar of engines became the sound of confidence itself. War, once thought to be won by tactics and bravery, was now clearly being decided by who could keep the engines running the longest. Technology determined not only who fought better, but who fought longer. The German panzer divisions fielded engineering marvels. The Panther and Tiger tanks were mechanically advanced, heavily armored, and devastating in battle. But their brilliance came with a curse: inefficiency. The Tiger I burned nearly 3 gallons of fuel per mile. Its 700 horsepower Maybach engine was powerful but gluttonous. The tank's weight, over 50 tons, meant that it guzzled fuel even at idle. Every kilometer demanded precious resources Germany could not spare. By contrast, the American M4 Sherman was lighter, simpler, and easier to maintain. Its radial engine wasn't glamorous, but it was reliable. The U.S. could ship thousands of Shermans overseas, keep them refueled, and repair them quickly. What it lacked in armor, it compensated for in numbers and logistics. The American war machine didn't rely on technological perfection. It relied on sustainability. In the air, the difference was even more pronounced. High-octane American aviation fuel, refined from rich crude and enhanced through chemical innovation, gave Allied aircraft superior range and performance. The P-51 Mustang could escort bombers deep into German territory, while the Luftwaffe's best pilots often sat grounded, their planes parked for lack of fuel. Germany's technological genius was undeniable, but its brilliance was stranded without energy. America's practicality, built on industrial foresight, proved far more lethal in the long run. Behind every tank and plane was a factory. Behind every convoy, a refinery. Germany had brilliance in design, but the United States had abundance in production. By 1944, American oil refineries were processing over 5 million barrels of crude oil per day, more than the entire Axis output combined. Companies like Standard Oil of New Jersey, Gulf, and Texaco worked directly with the U.S. military to develop new refining techniques that could rapidly produce specialized fuels for tanks, aircraft, and naval fleets. In contrast, Germany's synthetic fuel program was collapsing. Even before the bombing raids began, it could not match the demand of its expanding front lines. The Reich's war machine was a body outgrowing its veins. Every mile conquered required more oil than the nation could produce. American factories, meanwhile, didn't just meet their own needs, they exported war. Under the Lend-Lease program, the U.S. shipped hundreds of millions of barrels of petroleum to its allies. Soviet tanks that rolled into Berlin in 1945 ran on American gasoline. British bombers that struck German cities were fueled by Texas oil. It was a silent alliance of energy that spanned the world. The American oil industry became a weapon of mass movement, invisible but unstoppable. While Germany's factories built engines, America built the fuel that made those engines matter. War is geography, and geography decides logistics. Germany, landlocked and surrounded by enemies, fought with limited access to natural oil. Its only reliable sources came from Romania's Ploiești fields, and those were bombed relentlessly by American B-24 Liberators. By 1944, the skies over Ploiești were black with smoke, and production had dropped by more than half. The United States, by contrast, sat on vast oceans and boundless resources. It could drill in Texas, refine on the Gulf Coast, ship by tanker through the Caribbean, and distribute across the Atlantic with naval protection. When submarines threatened supply routes, America built pipelines instead. When trucks wore out, it built more. Every problem became an engineering challenge, and every solution multiplied output. This strategic advantage meant that America could afford to fight a global war on multiple fronts: Europe, Africa, and the Pacific, without ever running out of energy. Germany, even at its peak, fought with the clock ticking down on its fuel reserves. By late 1944, that clock had nearly stopped. The German High Command knew it. Their only hope was one final, desperate gamble: a counteroffensive through the Ardennes, designed not only to split the Allied lines, but to capture their fuel depots intact. The plan would become infamous. It was called the Battle of the Bulge, and it would test the last drops of Germany's fuel and the endurance of America's endless supply. The Battle of the WWII Bulge would soon become the clearest demonstration of what happens when one side runs on desperation and the other on abundance. But before that clash unfolded, the difference in fuel philosophy had already changed the way each nation thought about war. Adolf Hitler, despite his early military success, never fully understood logistics. His worldview was dominated by willpower and ideology, the belief that sheer determination could overcome material shortages. Even as fuel supplies dwindled, he demanded offensives that were logistically impossible. His field marshals, Guderian, Manstein, and others warned him repeatedly, "Without fuel, we cannot move." But Hitler saw hesitation as weakness. His obsession with seizing territory blinded him to the arithmetic of supply. Orders to hold ground, advance, or launch counterattacks were often issued with no consideration of fuel status. As a result, entire armored divisions became immobile. Tanks were hidden in forests to conserve what little gasoline they had left. In contrast, the American High Command viewed logistics as the foundation of every operation. Generals like Dwight D. Eisenhower, George S. Patton, and Omar Bradley coordinated directly with supply officers. Eisenhower's genius was not only in strategy, but in coordination. He understood that an army's strength lay not in the front lines, but in its rear echelons. Patton, often seen as the symbol of aggression and speed, was obsessed with fuel. His armored corps moved so rapidly across France in 1944 that supply officers struggled to keep up. But even his famous frustration, "My men can eat their belts, but my tanks have got to have gas," reflected an underlying truth. The Americans had so much fuel that their only limitation was distribution speed, not scarcity. For Hitler, logistics were a nuisance. For Eisenhower, they were the path to victory. That single difference in mindset between ideology and infrastructure defined the outcome of the war. To a German tanker on the Western Front, the difference was visible every day. Captured diaries and post-war testimonies paint a vivid picture. American convoys stretching to the horizon, columns of trucks filled with fuel drums, and airfields where engines never stopped roaring. One German officer, captured after the Ardennes, reportedly said, "The Americans have gasoline for every man, every truck, every lighter in their pocket." It wasn't sarcasm. It was awe. As the Wehrmacht's armored divisions withdrew through Belgium, soldiers witnessed something they had never seen before: a war machine without pause. Even when the Allies advanced too quickly and outran their supply lines, fuel shortages were temporary. Within days, fresh convoys arrived. Portable fuel depots sprang up overnight. Engineers repaired roads and pipelines in record time. The Germans, by comparison, faced impossible improvisations. Crews would drain fuel from knocked-out tanks, melt snow for water, and push their machines by hand to reposition them for defense. When winter arrived, many panzers froze solid, their engines unable to turn over. The myth of unstoppable blitzkrieg had reversed itself. Germany now fought a Crawlkrieg, a war of waiting, where tanks became bunkers instead of weapons. Every Allied explosion that lit the horizon was fueled by oil. Every German silence that followed was the sound of absence. And in that silence, German soldiers realized what their commanders never admitted. This war had been lost long before they stopped fighting. It had been lost when they ran out of fuel. America's fuel supremacy came at a human and industrial cost that often went unseen. Behind the roaring engines and endless convoys were millions of workers. Refinery crews, truck drivers, pipeline welders, many of whom never saw combat but faced danger daily. Explosions, fires, and exhaustion were constant threats. The Red Ball Express alone lost hundreds of men to accidents and ambushes. Yet, for those who served in the supply chain, there was pride in purpose. They knew that every gallon they delivered brought victory closer. Fuel was more than energy. It was belief made tangible. Germany's moral struggle, however, was one of denial. Its leaders refused to accept that war was no longer won by heroism or ideology, but by industry. Even as their soldiers froze in powerless tanks, propaganda continued to boast of miracle weapons. But no miracle could replace oil. There is an irony buried in the history of fuel. Both sides sought power, but only one understood what true power required. It was not found in speeches or symbols. It was found in the dull, steady rhythm of machines working day and night, across oceans and continents. By 1945, American fuel wasn't just winning battles, it was reshaping the planet. Tankers crossed the Pacific to feed MacArthur's island campaigns. Oil flowed through the Persian corridor to feed Soviet tanks on the Eastern Front. Even in the cold skies over Japan, B-29 bombers relied on the same high-octane fuel refined in the United States. Historians later called it the logistical century, the moment when energy became the true weapon of war. And as the ashes of Berlin settled, the lesson was clear. Whoever controlled fuel controlled history. German tank crews had witnessed this truth firsthand. Their disbelief wasn't about America's wealth or numbers. It was about the sheer scale of coordination, the sight of an enemy that never seemed to run dry. In their minds, war had always been a contest of courage. Now they saw it was a contest of capacity, and the side with the bigger fuel tank always got to write the ending. As the last German tanks sat powerless in the Ardennes snow, across the front lines, American engines thundered toward victory, fueled by an industrial rhythm that had become unstoppable. The turning point was near, and it would come with the last desperate German gamble, an offensive that burned through the Reich's final reserves. December 16, 1944. Dawn in the Ardennes. Fog clings to the hills of Belgium. The forest stands silent, heavy with snow. Then, without warning, the stillness erupts. Artillery thunders. Tanks lurch forward. And Germany launches its final gamble. Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Battle of the Bulge. This was Hitler's last great offensive on the Western Front, conceived not out of confidence but out of necessity. The plan was audacious. Strike through the weakly defended Ardennes, split the Allied armies, and capture the port of Antwerp. But buried beneath those ambitions was a far more desperate objective: fuel. Every German commander understood it. This offensive wasn't just about winning ground, it was about stealing gasoline. The German army had scraped together every drop it could find. Fuel was rationed to the liter. Panzer divisions were ordered to seize Allied depots along their route or risk stalling. Tank crews carried maps not just of terrain, but of rumored fuel dumps. The very success of the operation depended on how far they could drive before their engines went silent. For a brief, terrifying moment, it worked. On that foggy December morning, German armor smashed into the American lines with brutal efficiency. The 5th Panzer Army surged forward, pushing through the Ardennes in a spearhead of steel and snow. The fog grounded Allied aircraft and chaos erupted among American units. Entire regiments fell back, and for a few days, it seemed the old blitzkrieg spirit had returned. But beneath the momentum lay the same fatal flaw that had haunted Germany since 1941: the fuel gauge. Reports flowed in from the front. Panther tanks running low after only a few hours of combat. Fuel convoys delayed or destroyed by Allied air raids. Captured fuel drums discovered to contain the wrong grade of gasoline. German commanders, forced to choose between advancing and conserving fuel, hesitated. And hesitation in blitzkrieg was death. Meanwhile, the Americans, though stunned, were far from broken. Eisenhower and his staff grasped the reality of the German plan almost immediately. Their supply lines, though stretched, were resilient. Allied engineers redirected convoys, rerouted pipelines, and flooded the front with fuel and ammunition. Within days, what looked like a catastrophe turned into a test of endurance, a test America was built to win. The 101st Airborne dug in at Bastogne. Surrounded and freezing, they relied on a constant trickle of airdropped supplies, including precious fuel for the few tanks and vehicles defending the town. Patton's Third Army began its legendary pivot north, moving hundreds of miles through ice and mud to relieve Bastogne. His armored columns drank fuel by the ton, yet it was always there, waiting at each checkpoint, each depot, each convoy. German tank crews could hardly believe it. They intercepted fuel convoys, captured Allied supply dumps. But it was never enough. One panzer commander, Joachim Peiper, led the 1st SS Panzer Division deep into enemy lines. At first his advance was unstoppable, but by Christmas Eve, his tanks ran dry. He and his men abandoned their vehicles, blowing them up one by one to prevent capture. Dozens of tanks, perfectly functional, were left scattered in the snow. Victims not of battle, but of empty fuel tanks. Across the front, similar scenes unfolded. The Wehrmacht's offensive slowed, then froze. What had begun with thunder ended in silence once again. The same silence that had haunted German armor since the steppes of Russia. And as the fog lifted, so did the illusion. From the skies, the U.S. Army Air Forces unleashed relentless attacks on German columns. Without fuel to maneuver, panzers became targets. Roads clogged with abandoned vehicles. Fires burned for miles. German officers wept as they ordered the destruction of tanks that could no longer move. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's final throw of the dice, had consumed the last of Germany's strategic fuel reserves. The Reich had gambled everything on one strike and lost it all in a matter of weeks. On the American side, the story was different. Patton's advance alone consumed more fuel than the entire German offensive had available. Yet America's refineries, pipelines, and convoys absorbed the demand effortlessly. Fresh supplies rolled in from Normandy, from Cherbourg, from Antwerp. The flow never stopped. The contrast was almost symbolic. Germany, once the master of rapid war, now crawled to its end. America, once dismissed as a distant industrial giant, had become a global engine of war. Loud, unyielding, and endless. By the first week of January 1945, the Ardennes front stabilized. The Germans had lost over 600 tanks and armored vehicles, many not destroyed in battle, but abandoned when their engines died. The Allied lines held firm, and the once feared panzer divisions were shadows of their former selves. Hitler's war of movement had finally come to a standstill. Not from defeat in combat, but from the simple truth that wars are won by those who can keep moving. And as American tanks roared eastward once more, fueled by convoys stretching back to the English coast, the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt. By January 1945, the truth was undeniable. Germany's war machine was bleeding dry, not from bullets, but from the absence of fuel. From the forests of the Ardennes to the factories of the Ruhr, the signs of collapse were everywhere. Tanks that once spearheaded blitzkrieg now sat rusting in fields. Luftwaffe pilots were grounded, staring helplessly at empty drums and drained fuel trucks. The dream of a mechanized empire had been reduced to a nightmare of shortages. Hitler raged in his bunker, convinced that secret stockpiles must exist somewhere, hidden by cowardly officers or incompetent administrators. But there were no stockpiles left. The synthetic fuel plants, Germany's last lifeline, had been bombed relentlessly by Allied aircraft. Refineries at Leuna, Purlitz, and Berlin lay in ruins, their smoking chimneys a testament to American air supremacy. Every day, American B-17s and B-24s filled the skies, turning fuel depots and railway lines into twisted wreckage. The strategic bombing campaign wasn't glamorous. It wasn't immediate like tank battles or infantry charges, but it was devastatingly effective. It crippled the very heartbeat of the German war effort. By the time Hitler's generals reported the numbers, the situation was beyond recovery. Fuel production had dropped to less than 10% of what it had been a year earlier. Even elite units, like the 1st SS Panzer Corps and the Grossdeutschland Division, could barely muster enough gasoline to move a few dozen vehicles. Some divisions resorted to using horses once again. The very symbol of regression in a war that had begun as the dawn of modern mechanized warfare. Meanwhile, the Americans were accelerating. Fuel from the U.S. flowed across the Atlantic in convoys of Liberty ships, through ports rebuilt in record time, and along pipelines that stretched over mountains and rivers. The Red Ball Express, the logistical miracle that had powered the Allied advance after D-Day, was still rolling. Thousands of trucks, driven day and night by mostly African-American soldiers, carried millions of gallons of fuel, ammunition, and supplies from Normandy to the front. The roads were muddy, frozen, and often under attack. Yet the convoy never stopped. Every gallon delivered meant another Sherman tank moving forward, another bomber taking off, another army pressing eastward. Every delay on the German side meant another day of retreat, another city lost, another dream shattered. Even German prisoners, captured at the front, spoke in disbelief. They couldn't comprehend how America could sustain such endless motion. They had grown up in a nation where fuel was a privilege, rationed, protected, hoarded for the decisive battle. But for the Americans, fuel was like air, invisible, constant, and everywhere. In the snow-covered villages of Belgium, American soldiers joked that the real hero of the war wasn't Patton or Eisenhower, it was gasoline. Without it, none of them would be there. One tanker scrawled it on the side of his Sherman. "This tank runs on God, guts, and gasoline." It wasn't far from the truth, because behind every victory, behind the liberation of France, the push through Belgium, the crossing of the Rhine, stood an army of men who didn't fight on the front lines, but who delivered the lifeblood of war: fuel. By late January, as the Allies pushed the Germans back across the Siegfried Line, the contrast became a grim symbol of the war itself. On one side, the Reich, technologically brilliant but strategically exhausted. On the other, America, a nation of factories and fields, turning raw oil into unstoppable motion. American engineers built makeshift refineries on captured territory. Fuel depots sprouted across France and Belgium like metallic cities. Pipelines were extended under rivers, across mountains, even beneath the English Channel, and engineering, feat known as Operation PLUTO, pipeline under the E2, ocean. Each drop of that fuel was a victory in itself. When Patton's army finally crossed the Rhine in March 1945, the bridges shook under the weight of thousands of tanks, trucks, and armored vehicles. The Germans fired everything they had left: rockets, artillery, desperation. But it didn't matter anymore. The Americans were moving too fast, supplied too well, and too deeply fueled to stop. Inside the collapsing Reich, the last reserves were being spent in vain. Entire panzer divisions were forced to abandon their vehicles, leaving them lined up on the roadside, engines dry, crews marching eastward on foot. The once mighty armored spearheads had turned into columns of weary men with rifles slung over their shoulders. And as they trudged through the mud, they passed by American convoys roaring the other way. Columns of Sherman tanks, half-tracks, and fuel trucks, engines humming, exhausts smoking, heading straight for the heart of Germany. For the German soldiers, it was more than defeat. It was disbelief. How could an enemy have so much, not just weapons or men, but movement? In their diaries, captured officers wrote of their astonishment. The Americans fight with machines that never rest. Their trucks come day and night, filled with fuel, food, and more machines. We destroy them, and they return the next day, doubled in number. That was the war's defining contrast. Germany running on fumes. America running on abundance. By the spring of 1945, as Allied forces closed in from both east and west, the once feared panzer divisions were silent. The engines that had once shaken Europe now lay cold and still. The war had come full circle. From the roaring tanks of 1939 to the empty ones of 1945. The end of the war would not be decided by a single battle or general, but by the quiet, unstoppable hum of an American fuel convoy somewhere on a muddy European road. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the ruins told their own story. Cities were silent, bridges broken, refineries flattened. But among the wreckage, one truth gleamed unmistakably clear. The side that could move. 1. Germany's armies had been fierce, disciplined, and technically advanced. But war, by its nature, is not a contest of bravery alone. It's a contest of endurance. And in that, the United States had built an advantage no army in history had ever possessed. Behind every Sherman tank, every Thunderbolt fighter, every ship and truck, there was a river of fuel flowing from American soil to the front lines of Europe. Oil from Texas, Oklahoma, and California. Synthetic rubber from new plants built almost overnight. Refineries working day and night. Manned by millions of civilians who never saw combat, but fought the war just the same. In 1944 alone, American industry produced over 6 billion barrels of oil. Enough to fuel not one, but several modern armies. By contrast, the entire German Reich, reliant on synthetic fuel from coal and oil fields seized in Romania, struggled to produce even a fraction of that. The difference wasn't just logistical, it was philosophical. Germany had built its war machine around control, precision, scarcity, hierarchy. America built its around abundance, motion, scale, and flexibility. Where the Germans conserved, the Americans consumed. Where the Germans rationed, the Americans flooded the battlefield. It wasn't waste. It was momentum. Fuel was more than gasoline. It was belief. Belief that no matter the terrain, no matter the odds, the convoy would always arrive. That the next drum of oil, the next tank, the next aircraft would never be the last. For German crews watching this machine in motion, the psychological impact was devastating. Diaries recovered after the war told of disbelief, admiration, even envy. One panzer commander wrote, "Their tanks never stop. Their engines run as if they drink the earth itself. We have courage. They have power." In a sense, that summed up the final years of the war. Courage facing power. And in industrial warfare, power wins. By 1945, fuel had become the real currency of victory. Every Allied plan, from D-Day to the Rhine crossing, was drawn not just with maps and troop counts, but with fuel lines. Planners in London and Washington understood what Hitler never fully accepted. Logistics decides wars. The Red Ball Express had proven it. Operation PLUTO had confirmed it. Even as the front stretched hundreds of miles inland, the flow never stopped. Engineers laid down new pipelines faster than the German army could destroy them. If a bridge fell, portable pontoons replaced it. If a fuel dump exploded, another was already on the way. The American system wasn't elegant, but it was relentless. When the Allies liberated Paris, the streets filled not just with tanks and soldiers, but with convoys, rows upon rows of fuel trucks rolling through the city. A parade of supply and steel. Civilians cheered them as if they were heroes. And in truth, they were, because behind every victory was a driver, a mechanic, a refinery worker, people who never saw the enemy, but broke his will just the same. The war's end brought reflection even among America's leaders. General Eisenhower himself called logistics the deciding factor in modern war. General Patton, never one to mince words, said it more bluntly. "My men can eat their belts, but my tanks have gotta have gas." And they did. From Normandy's beaches to the Elbe River, the hum of engines became the soundtrack of liberation. Each drop of fuel burned brought the world closer to peace, and forever changed how nations would fight. Because after 1945, Every military on Earth understood what America had demonstrated: that wars are not only won by courage, but by capacity, by the ability to sustain movement when others cannot. In the decades that followed, oil became the lifeblood of geopolitics. Nations rose and fell not by ideology, but by access to energy. Pipelines became as strategic as borders. Refineries became as vital as fortresses. The lesson learned on the roads of France and Belgium echoed into the Cold War and beyond. Germany's engineers had built magnificent machines, but America had built the world's first truly industrial army, one that fought not just with weapons, but with wheels, engines, and endless supply. When German tankers said, "We couldn't believe America had fuel for everyone," it wasn't just astonishment, it was acknowledgement. They had witnessed the arrival of a new kind of warfare, one powered not by ideology or even technology alone, but by logistics, abundance, and sheer industrial might. As Europe rebuilt from the ashes, American fuel and machinery became the foundation of recovery, the Marshall Plan, the rebirth of industry, the highways that would reshape continents. And yet, beneath it all, the echoes of that war remained: the sound of engines that never stopped, the convoys that never ended, the lesson written in the mud and snow of the Ardennes. Power is movement. Movement is survival. And survival belongs to those who can keep moving the longest. The soldiers who once watched American convoys roll past in disbelief could not have known that they were witnessing not just the end of a war, but the beginning of a new age, an age where victory would no longer belong to the strongest or bravest, but to those who could fuel the future.